Dry January, that's where it's January with only just a little bit of vermouth, right?
Did you write that joke?
I didn't write the joke. It kind of just occurred to me. Have either of you ever done Dry January?
I have never done Dry January, but I'm not going to lie. None of my Januaries is particularly wet.
I have tried Dry January, and I think that it's a very good experience and very good exercise for people to do.
I do the glass of champagne toast right at New Year's, and you gotta spit it out right at midnight. I go for Dry January, but I end up more doing damp January. This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm Drew Goins, author of the Today's Opinions newsletter, and this week we're talking about the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory about drinking and how it can lead to an increased risk of cancer. Recent national health data shows that the majority of American adults reported having had a drink in the last month, and it doesn't take a survey to see how entwined drinking is in American culture. But is it really bad to hit up a happy hour every week, a couple times a week? And in a world where it feels like everything can cause cancer, is reducing how much we drink a priority? For people who get some pleasure or joy from drinking, is it worth taking the risk? I'm joined today by two of my colleagues to talk through all this and more.
Hey, Drew. Hey, Molly. Nice to talk with you and to everyone. I'm Leana Wen. I'm a contributing opinions columnist at the Washington Post. I'm also a physician and someone who thinks about alcohol and alcohol use and, as you were saying, Drew, the pleasure of drinking combined with what risks there might be.
I'm Molly Roberts. I'm an opinion writer at the Post. I'm not a scientist, and I am a light drinker.
Thank you, guys. Let's start with the personal. So when you saw this advisory from Vivek Murthy, this is the Surgeon General, this is America's top doctor. Did it have any effect on you and how you think about your own behavior around alcohol? Did it make you want to modify anything?
Well, for me, no. And that's because the evidence that was presented is not new to me. Although I think the reason why Dr. Murthy presented this was, it seems like, according to a study that he cites, that most Americans are not aware of the link between alcohol and cancer. I think people are aware that heavy drinking is associated with negative health outcomes like liver disease and heart disease and cancer, but I don't think they know that there is a link that's seen even at moderate levels of drinking when it comes to at least 7 different types of cancer. And I think that it is important to for people to understand this in thinking about risks, because there are lots of activities that we engage in our lives that have risk, but how we consider it really depends on each person. So, for example, one of the studies cited by the Surgeon General is that the risk of developing breast cancer over a woman's lifespan is about 11 out of 100 for people who drink not at all or very little. But for those who drink 1 alcoholic beverage a day, the absolute risk goes up to 13 out of 100. For 2 drinks a day, it's 15 out of 100. And so for some people, they might say, look, I have a significant family history of breast cancer. I do everything else in my life to reduce that risk of breast cancer. I want to reduce my risk further by cutting my drinking from 2 drinks to 1 drink or something like that. I think that would be very reasonable. But I also think that there are plenty of other people who will say, look, there are lots of things that contribute to cancer risk. Actually, alcohol is the 3rd preventable cause. The first 2 are tobacco and obesity. And then there are lots of things under there. For example, lack of exercise, ultra-processed food. I mean, some people might say, I try to maximize other things in my life that are healthful behaviors when it comes to cancer risk. I can afford to take this one thing that brings pleasure.
Yeah, I'll confess that I was one of the people who was surprised to see this. I'm in that slightly more than half of Americans who did not see this associated risk top of mind. And I'm also not 100% ready to modify my behavior immediately. This is new information to me. I learned this last week, and I need to take some time to, take stock. What is the benefit that I get from alcohol? I consider myself a moderate drinker. Do I want to drop down to that level of 1 or fewer drinks per day? I don't know yet. Molly, was this new information for you?
It definitely was new information for me. I don't think it's going to change the amount I drink because very luckily for me, I probably drink 1 or 2 drinks a week. In fact, the way it's likeliest to change my behavior is to prevent me from forming a habit in the future. I'd been told, and I'm sure that Lena's familiar with this debate, that it would be good for me to drink a glass of red wine with dinner, maybe every day. And I'd thought, I really ought to drink more with dinner. So perhaps I won't be doing that now.
Yeah, research shows that, younger people in particular, I'm gonna throw ourselves in that bucket, Molly, flatter ourselves. We're both in our early 30s. Research shows that young people are headed away from drinking. They're drinking less than previous generations. This dry January, it's very popular online with young people. We see sales of non-alcoholic beers rising, these canned cocktails that are non-alcoholic. Leana, I want to go to you first. Do you think this is a function of people becoming more aware of the health risks, or is it just a cultural shift that's much needed, or is it both of those things happening at the same time? What do you make of that?
Well, I'm still considering the fact that I'm no longer considered the young person in this conversation. So, I wrote.
We're all young to me.
You're young at heart. I wrote a column last year looking at trends, and it's interesting because when you look at the trends, it does look like, and you're accurate in saying, Drew, that alcohol use among young people has been trending down, and in fact appears to be replaced by marijuana use. Mm-hmm. Because at the same time that you see the trends going down for alcohol, we're also seeing regular cannabis use going up. And in fact, we're now getting to the point where people who use cannabis on a daily basis is higher than the number of people who drink alcohol every day across demographics, which is really interesting. But what's also interesting is that it does not appear that the decreased alcohol use among young people is sustained over the course of their lifetimes.
Oh, interesting.
Also, men are drinking less, but women are drinking more. And where that appears to really take into effect are in the 30 to 45-year-old group. There have been a number of studies done recently looking at professional women and the increased drinking in this group. Both excessive drinking, so drinking more than a drink per day on a regular basis for women, but also binge drinking, going out for an evening and drinking 4 drinks in that evening or 5 drinks for men. But that binge drinking in this professional women's group is increasing. But I will say with the Surgeon General's advisory, one thing that stood out to me is when you look at the risks for individuals, what the greatest risk is not seen in moderate drinkers, right? It's in people who drink excessively. It's for binge drinkers because you have all that alcohol hitting you all at once. And it's in people with alcohol dependence who have signs of addiction to alcohol and people who are drinking in order to cover up something else, like loneliness or depression or trauma or anxiety or something else. And so I think it's a good attention-grabbing headline to say, hey, look at alcohol and cancer. But I think if we really want to make an impact on public health, we should be focusing on the people who are binge drinking. 61 million Americans reported binge drinking in the last month. Right? That's the group that I would really focus our attention to, not the people who are drinking a glass of wine with their dinner at night.
The marijuana thing, I learned a new term while trying to read up for this, which was California sober. I think that's what perhaps the kids are saying when they're substituting marijuana for drinking. I wouldn't know. I'm not actually that young compared to the Gen Zers. But it's definitely true. It's worse, I imagine, to substitute with plenty of substances that aren't alcohol. But I also wonder, and I have no real idea whether this would be something that would be likely to happen, but this is related to the binge drinking thought. If people limit their alcohol consumption during the week, say, if they tell themselves, well, I'm not going to have a beer when I come home, but then they go into the weekend thinking, I've been so healthy, this isn't that many drinks per week, and they have 5, 6, 7 beers, is that worse than if they had? So that is potentially concerning.
Yes, in fact, it's interesting because in response to some of my columns last year, I had readers write in with exactly this question. Is it better that to have a drink every night, or is it better to just go nuts one weekend day, but then save up during the week, so to speak? And the answer here is really unequivocal. It is much worse to binge drink. Binge drinking is associated with what you might expect, with a higher rate of injuries. For example, car accidents, burns, drowning, falls, right? So, but not only that, alcohol is a toxin. And the metabolites produced when your body processes alcohol, those are toxins too. So normally our body can get rid of these toxins, but if you are hit by a giant bolus of it all at once, it's much harder for the body to deal with. And so heavy drinking, excessive drinking, binge drinking, that's associated with all kinds of problems like pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas, heart arrhythmias, heart failure. It is much better to drink. If you have to drink 5 drinks a week, space it out over 5 days. Don't drink it all in one instance.
There's this really interesting idea that I'm seeing emerge, which is that like drinking or like mind-altering pleasure generally is this like zero-sum thing, right? For so many people, it seems like I'm either going to have my drinks throughout the week or I'm really going to make up for it on the weekend. If I cut out drinking, here I am trying out weed, right? And on the weed point, I did want to ask, Molly kind of asserted it's worse. Is that true? Is this an out of the frying pan and into the fire situation?
I think it depends on the individual. For young people, we know that cannabis is not good for the developing brain. And brain development can occur in people's 20s as well. And so I think if we're talking about teenagers who otherwise would try a beer here and there, who are now turning to smoking marijuana every day, that's really bad.
Right.
Drunk driving is also very bad. And it's more likely that somebody could end up having a terrible accident out of from drunk driving. But also cannabis it alters your judgment and perception too. And so that's also not great. So I think the idea, though, that we can replace alcohol with cannabis and it's a safe, quote unquote, safe alternative is wrong. I don't know how to compare the two exactly in terms of harmful effects, but excessive of either is bad, but replacement, not a good idea.
Yeah.
And it's not just cannabis, right? I mean, maybe that's for more casual drinking, casual settings. But when it comes to the partying scene, there are other substitutes big these days. I assume we don't want a lot more ketamine consumption compared
we don't want more ketamine consumption.
Only for the horses.
Leana Wen coming out with a bold medical statement that we don't want more people taking ketamine. I was going to ask, what about the positive benefits of alcohol, which we see like in terms of social capital, like all of these friendships that, developed, the people who went up and asked out their future wife because they'd had a drink at the bar. But then the more I thought about that question, the more I was like, okay, well, if I had been doing this podcast 30 years ago, 40 years ago, would I have been saying, well, what about all the positive benefits of smoking? You met someone out on the smoke break. Do you think that a few decades from now, Leana, we're going to be in a place where we're thinking about alcohol the way that we used to think about smoking?
I don't think so. But I also say this as someone who enjoys alcohol, not because it is mind-altering, but because I like the taste of alcohol, and specifically of wine. My husband and I both enjoy wine with some meals. We got married on a vineyard. We have friends who own vineyards. I think it's different to think about alcohol as with smoking in the same way, perhaps, or in a similar way that we cannot think about sugary drinks, sugar-sweetened beverages in the same way that we think about smoking. To be fair, I do think that the idea, Molly, that you mentioned earlier, that drinking alcohol, drinking wine specifically is good for your heart and that you need to be drinking a glass of wine every night, I think that is outdated. There's such controversial data surrounding alcohol and heart protection that I just don't think it's worth it, right? And whatever benefit you may get from one glass of wine a night, even let's say that it gives you some small degree of cardio protection, it's outweighed by the potential cancer risk. So I don't think you're going to meet a doctor these days who will say to you, hey, if you want to improve your heart, forget about your blood pressure medications or walking outside or whatever. Go drink wine. I don't think we should be talking about the health benefits specifically of alcohol.
Certainly.
But could it have social benefits? Could there be pleasure that one derives from drinking alcohol the way that you derive from eating cookies? Like cookies are not essential for your health. But I also don't want to be telling my patients, stop eating cakes and cookies if that's something that they really enjoy.
Yeah.
I am now fully convinced that I don't need to have a glass of wine with dinner to improve my heart health, but I do think that accepting the occasional cocktail from my husband, who loves to make his little cocktails, may be better for my relationship, for my emotional health. So I do think there's a certain extent to which alcohol is just more interesting, than cigarettes, not just because it's a social lubricant, but because, like you said, there is a real and vibrant culture around wine. There is around cocktail making, too.
Well, speaking of the pleasure that we derive from drinking, I do want to talk more about how we weigh the risks versus rewards of drinking and a lot of other things. But first, let's take a quick break.
I'm Alexandra Petri, and I write a humor column for the Washington Post. I think sometimes it helps to have somebody yelling at the news with you. These days when people might be more inclined to tune out of the news, if there's a way to make news consumption more pleasant, hopefully I'm helping with that. I consume unhealthy amounts of news thanks to our wonderful news side who are always bringing in stories. I look at the paper, I become indignant about things that are going on, and then I try to figure out a way of writing about them that will hopefully make my readers indignant too. I think the most important thing subscribers do is support our actual journalism, which is how I learn what's going on in the world. And we have so many phenomenal writers whom I love to read because they're deeply well-sourced and they know what's happening, and I can learn what to be indignant about. When you subscribe to the Washington Post, you support this kind of journalism and the people behind it. That and coffee. A lot of coffee. I'm Alexandra Petri, and I'm one of the people behind the Post.
Welcome back. I'm Drew Goins, and this is Impromptu. So, I feel like I go through life, and every 2 days I'm seeing something else that's a new carcinogen, right? We're being told about things that are going to harm us. Microplastics, I can hardly open the microwave these days and put something in it without being like, I'm signing my death sentence right now. We were discussing the podcast beforehand, and a colleague was overhearing. She's Gen Z, and she calls out, I mean, with all the fires, how am I supposed to think about alcohol? Which is, an exaggeration, not entirely true, but the state of the world and specifically just, cancer risks too, emanations from your gas stove. All of these warnings are super overwhelming, at least for me, and they're really, really easy to tune out. How do you think these warnings accumulate psychologically, Leana?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it does become overwhelming to people. I see this in my patients as well. Also in a patient encounter, you have limited time to address issues with your patients. And also you can't tell them to do everything because then they'll end up doing nothing, right? You have to focus on what's the most important. I would always ask people how much they are drinking. And it ends up being more than 1 drink a week. I would ask them if they're saying 5 drinks a week or 10 drinks a week. I would definitely ask them about spacing of the drinks. And then I would address this with them if it's actually excessive drinking. I would also ask them questions that assess for dependence. So things like, have they tried to stop drinking? Are they once they start, are they unable to stop? Do they have trouble controlling the amount of alcohol that they're having? And also, when are they drinking? Is it only socially, or are they drinking alone, which could be a red flag? Are they trying to self-medicate essentially because there's something else that's really hurting them? And then we can get at those things. But I give this clinical example because we have only so much time, we have only so much focus, and we have to choose what are the issues that we really want to dedicate our attention to as clinicians or as individuals for ourselves. And so for someone, they might not be aware of the risks of alcohol. And for them, cutting down from 4 drinks a day to 1 drink a day is not that big of a deal, but would really improve their health. So we could focus on that. But for somebody else, if they're only drinking, let's say one drink a day, but they're not exercising at all, and they're eating really fatty foods and having lots of soda, I'm not going to be talking about drinking alcohol as the thing that they need to cut back. I'm going to focus on these other things. And so I think maybe that's one way to think about it. What's really the problem? If alcohol is a big problem, and also what's low-hanging fruit for all these other risks that are in your life.
Right. I mean, it sounds like you're talking to your patients plenty about alcohol where warranted. For the people who are not going in and talking to their physician with any frequency and who are more frequently encountering alcohol, do you think the Surgeon General's recommendation that we get a warning label making more clear the cancer risk is an effective strategy?
I think that it could raise awareness for some people. Again, people who have a genetic predisposition to certain cancers, who may not even be aware of how much they're drinking. And so they tally it up and they say, oh my goodness, I'm actually at the high end. Maybe I can cut down a little bit. To that point, I also don't want for people to be tuning out warnings by public health officials. Because if you say that everything is a problem, then they start thinking, well, I can't even live my life. Just let me have some pleasures left, right? And so I think that's the other concern. If this were me choosing, I don't think I would have chosen this as the issue that the Surgeon General would part on.
That's
I think there are lots of other things. I actually would put cannabis up there because I think far fewer people even recognize the risks of cannabis use.
Right.
I think the Surgeon General and his work on social connection has been so important, and him calling out the problems of excessive use of smartphones and social media by young adults has been so important. I don't want that work to be drowned out by this.
Molly, do you go through life worrying about your hierarchy of cancer risks?
Funny that you ask. I have assembled a list of carcinogens.
I did not know what you had been writing in your notebook, but I'm thrilled to hear that this is the answer.
Non-stick cookware, mattresses, they have flame retardants in them, insecticides, pesticides, shower curtains, leather chairs and wooden sofas, processed meat, dairy. I don't know if those all have warning labels. If they do, I have been ignoring them. My understanding is that there's a much firmer link between alcohol and particularly breast cancer, but other cancers too, than these things. But if you just tell me generally, oh, those are all carcinogenic and they all have warning labels, I'm going to kind of shrug at all of them, I think, unfortunately. On the other hand, if I am told in a more considered way, here are the big risks, then I'm at least going to calibrate my risk depending on how dangerous it is. So I'm not going to smoke cigarettes. I'm not even going to have the occasional cheeky cigarette after a few too many drinks because that's double cancer risk. And I'm going to wear sunscreen. So I suppose that's how I think about it.
Paragon of Health, Molly Roberts, giving us the worst cover of We Didn't Start the Fire since I've got that list. As we come to the end of the conversation, I wonder if you could just wrap it up for us, Leana. You know, I'm going into life with this new information, new to me from the Surgeon General. How do I weigh the risks versus rewards of drinking?
I think understanding your relationship with alcohol and the role that alcohol plays in your life, that's going to be the most important thing, rather than just focusing on this one link between alcohol and cancer, which is real and is important for people to know. But I think that there is a lot more to life than simply avoidance of risk.
With that, the rest of Dry January beckons, and we have to wrap this up. Thank you both for joining me for this episode of Impromptu.
Thank you.
Thanks, Drew.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson, edited by Demir Marusik, Chris Sulentrop, and Allison Michaels, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please send us your thoughts about alcohol, today's conversation, at impromptu@washpost.com. And if you're liking the show, please be sure to leave us a review or comment on your favorite podcast app.